On September 18, 1931, the Japanese military invaded Manchuria, a large Chinese province north of Japan. The resulting conflict, known as the Manchurian Incident, lasted 2 years as the Japanese military established an independent state called Manchukuo. During this time, the League of Nations, the US, China, and Japan debated the legitimacy of the invasion. The League of Nations tried to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Diplomacy failed with serious consequences. Japan left the League of Nations, escalated its conflict with China to set the stage for the Second Sino-Japanese War, and ultimately joined World War II as an Axis power. The League of Nations' failure also resulted in its dissolution. Since the start of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, Japan viewed Manchuria as strategic to protecting its colonies in Korea and believed it had special rights in the province. For example, Japan built, owned, and patrolled the South Manchurian Railway. Japanese military extremists recognized the importance of Japan's interests in Manchuria and, reacting to China's unification efforts and Russia's advancements in the area, began to take action without the Japanese government's consent. In 1928, the Japanese Kwantung Army bombed a train carrying the warlord leader of Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin, killing him. The Japanese government, led by Prime Minister Tanaka Gichi, did not approve of the military's actions. When Tanaka tried to counter the bombers without the army's support, he was forced to resign. His successor, Hamaguchi Osachi, also attempted to put a check on the military's power. He was assassinated in November 1930. Meanwhile, economic depression spread from the United States around the world. To help prop up their economies, the United States and other countries put tariffs on their imports. This hit Japan especially hard because, as an island nation with few natural resources of its own, it relied heavily on importing and exporting. Japan had no choice but to pay the tariffs, but its search for other ways to obtain essential resources led it to consider Manchuria as a viable target of conquest. Manchuria had numerous natural resources such as oil, rubber, lumber, and farmland. It also offered the Japanese government an opportunity to obtain more living space for Japan's rural poor, whom the government felt didn't contribute to the economy. With the Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin dead and troops of the Kwantung Army already positioned in Manchuria, the military didn't wait for approval from the Japanese government, led by new Prime Minister Wakatsuki Raijiro, to expand its control in Manchuria. On September 18, 1931, the Kwantung Army bombed the South Manchurian Railway in the city of Mukden. The railway suffered minimal damage and the train still reached its destination, but because Japan owned the railway, the Japanese military was able to frame the Chinese for the attack. It used the Chinese bombing as a pretext to invade Manchuria. Within 5 months, Manchuria was under the Kwantung Army's control. Japanese Prime Minister Wakatsuki could not stop the army, and in December 1931 he resigned. Inukai Tsuyoshi took over as prime minister, but he was assassinated in 1932 when naval officers discovered Inukai's plans to limit the military's power. Meanwhile, Japanese citizens supported the military's invasion of Manchuria because radio broadcasts of military events in real time whipped citizens into a war frenzy. As a final attempt to satisfy the military and Japanese citizens, advisors to Emperor Hirohito made Saito Makoto, a retired Navy admiral, prime minister. Although the Japanese government disapproved of the invasion, it refused to pull out its troops because it would be embarrassing on the international stage if Japan was seen as having no control over its military. In fact, once the invasion commenced and the Kwantung Army was successful, the Japanese government decided to send reinforcements and support. By the end of 1932, Japan completely occupied Manchuria, and the Japanese military established a new independent state called Manchukuo. China put up little resistance to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Although China's president, Chiang Kai-shek, had sufficient troops in Manchuria to stand up to the Japanese attacks, he withdrew his forces. The Chinese troops lacked the experience and skill of the Kwantung Army, and Chiang Kai-shek chose to focus on the Chinese Revolution and combating Chinese Republicans. China did appeal, however, to the League of Nations to investigate the Manchurian incident. The United States took notice of Japan's invasion of Manchuria and declared it to be a violation of the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact. This pact was a post-World War I diplomatic agreement that attempted to outlaw war. It was signed by 15 countries, including Japan and China. The U.S., not a member of the League of Nations, brought this complaint to the League, which refused to enforce the pact. Then, the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson wrote the Stimson Doctrine, stating that the U.S. would not recognize any territory obtained by force. When Japan ignored the Stimson Doctrine, Stimson stated that the Manchurian conflict violated the 1922 Nine-Power Treaty, which was put in place to protect the territorial integrity of China, even though it acknowledged Japan's presence in Manchuria. Amidst the worldwide depression, the League of Nations didn't have the support from its member countries to hold Japan accountable to these former diplomatic efforts. Instead, the League of Nations created the Lytton Committee. Headed by Sir Lytton, the British ambassador to the League of Nations, the committee went to the site of the Mukden incident and investigated the railway bombing and the invasion as a whole. After the Lytton Committee's investigation, its members were divided. On one side, Sir Lytton wanted to bring the hammer down on Japan for their actions. On the other side, Henri Claudel of France thought it would be better for the League to stay on Japan's good side.
That report doesn't, take such a harsh stance against Japan. It's because ultimately it was this negotiation between Lytton, who wanted, the more stringent response, and Claudel, who was, a bit softer in his approach.
In its September 1932 presentation, the committee found, without any declaration of war, a large part of Chinese territory had been forcibly seized and occupied by Japanese troops. But the League refused to recognize that Japan framed the Chinese for the bombing of the South Manchurian Railway. The committee recommended that the Kwantung Army retreat to its former role as patrollers of the South Manchurian Railway, and that the League of Nations refuse to sanction any actions taken after the Mukden incident. With the support of the Lytton Committee's declaration behind it, the League of Nations then told Japan that they needed to withdraw from Manchuria. The Japanese ambassador Yosuke Matsuoka debated the findings and attempted to alter the League's opinion. Although neither Matsuoka nor the Japanese government wanted to withdraw from the League, when the League refused to agree with Japan's position, the Japanese delegation walked out of the League of Nations because of the influence of Araki Sadao, the belligerent Japanese Minister of War.
Araki, he regarded the League as this really restrictive organization that was preventing Japan from expanding onto the Asian continent. And so he was really the primary reason why the Japanese delegation walked out of the League.
The League of Nations' diplomatic efforts failed. Japan would not return to the League of Nations again. The failure of the League of Nations diplomacy had three primary consequences. First, following Japan's departure from the League of Nations, the relationship between China and Japan continued to deteriorate. The Kwantung Army felt empowered by the League's lack of resistance to their aggression in Manchuria. To protect the newly formed Manchukuo, the Japanese military fought to take control of Reihei, a Chinese province. The battle for Reihei was short. Between February 21st and March 1st, 1933, the Kwantung Army defeated China's forces. The two countries signed the Taungoo Truce on May 21, 1933, a treaty that ended the crisis in Manchuria as China formally acknowledged the existence of Manchukuo as a Japanese state. The Taungoo Truce held precariously until 1937, when the Second Sino-Japanese War began. It wasn't until 1945, when the Chinese, with the help of the Soviet Union, won the Second Sino-Japanese War, that Japan was forced to withdraw from Manchuria. Another consequence of the League of Nations' failed efforts at a solution to the Manchurian incident was that Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy gained respect for Japan in its authoritarian show of strength against Manchuria and the League of Nations. When Japan became a complete authoritarian state in 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany. The Tripartite Pact was an agreement that, if any of the three countries were attacked, they would come to one another's defense. The final major consequence of the League of Nations' inability to stop Japan was that it was a significant contributor to the dissolution of the League. The failure to control or sanction Japan for its invasion of Manchuria revealed how ineffective the League was over major world powers. In 1946, the League of Nations was dissolved. The Japanese military's invasion of Manchuria in the 1930s led the international community to debate how to rein in Japan's power. The United States' efforts were unsuccessful, so China and the U.S. turned to the League of Nations and the work of the Lytton Committee to determine the consequences that Japan would face. Japan rejected the League's diplomatic efforts, namely the Lytton Report, with serious consequences for Japan and the League of Nations. The deteriorated relationship between Japan and China has never fully recovered. Japan isolated itself from the League of Nations countries and the United States, aligned itself with the authoritarian Axis powers, and ultimately was defeated in World War II. Lastly, the League of Nations' failure to rein in Japan through the use of debate and diplomacy revealed the League's weakness to address world issues and contributed to its dissolution. After World War II, Japan was left to pick up the pieces of its broken country.